Alright, welcome back to the next tutorial, which is going to start dealing with some of our level 2 concepts. The level 2 concepts that are needed for NCEA are the use of collections such as arrays or lists, and the use of called methods, often referred to as subroutines or functions. So we're going to start here with the use of arrays. So up to this point we've been using variables, and variables can hold one value, which have been pretty handy to this point, but they do have limitations. If we're wanting to store all of the ages within a class, say of students, then we'd have to create 25, 27 odd variable names to be able to store that, and that is going to get quickly confusing. So one of the ways that we can get around that is by using an array which will store a collection of related items. So in order to go through and set up an array, I've just started a new project here. We're going to declare the data type of what we'd like to store within this array. So if we were to use our example of the likes of students' ages, we're going to use integers, and we indicate that we'd like to start an array by using two square brackets like so. Whenever you see that in code, it means that we're dealing with an array. The next thing that we're going to give it or use is we're going to give it a name. So this is the name that we'll give it, so we can access it in C#, and I'm going to call it array ages. Okay, notice the camel case notation. Okay, the next thing that we're going to try and do is we're going to now tell it a little bit more that we'd like it to be a new array, and that it's going to be an array of integers. And then we finish this off with the square brackets once more. Now, one of the things that we're wanting here with an array is the fact that we need to create or give it a size. So with arrays, they need to be defined in terms of their size. If we go and overwrite the array size later on, it will make a copy of the array. So that's one of the reasons why I probably prefer using the likes of lists, because of the fact that we do have the ability to use them more flexibly and they're dynamically able to resize. However, arrays sometimes have their place. Okay, so when we're wanting to, take a word like the word Hamilton and then break that up into little spaces and have each letter assigned something, we will use a character array to be able to do that. So for this situation, I've got 27 people in my class, so I'm going to allocate 27 spaces in memory for things to be kind of assigned. Okay, so we're now ready to have items added into this array. So the way that arrays work is that when we try and load something into the array, it will not go into item or index number 1. Arrays and lists are always going to be 0 based, which means the very first item in which it's going to be stored will be actually in index number 0. Okay, so if we were wanting to go through and look at adding something now to this item, we're going to need to look at giving it the value in terms of where we're wanting it to be stored, and we're now going to give it a value. So if we were to try and do some people's ages within the class, in this index 0, so the very first index that will hold something, I'm going to hold a value of 16. And using a bit of magic of copy and pasting, we'll simply go through, plug some of these things in, and then I'm going to look at altering these indexes here, so you can see how the program's going to be filling up the likes of my array and what happens when things aren't quite right. Okay, so here it is, my numbers are being all jumbled around a little bit. And because we've got the likes of these integers, they can go quite large, and they could also store negative numbers as well. But the main point to note here is the fact that we've got items between 0 and 7. So even though it says between 0 and 7, in actual fact we've got 8 elements within this array, because of the fact that we start at 0 and we finish at 7. So if I wanted to maybe free up a bit of the space, I could go through down here and say that, look, hey, I'm wanting to hold 8 elements within this array. If I was to go back to my original thing here, which I'm going to show you now of what's going to look like, if I try and put a breakpoint in here and try and run through my program, you'll see how this array gets initialized and filled up. So at the moment here, if I push F10, you'll notice now next to the locals window a little arrow appears, which allows us to show each of these indexes ready to receive data. And it's given me 0 to 26 as an index, which means it goes between up to 27 elements within this array. So the very first line of code that I've got here within my array is to try and load in some numbers. So push F10 here, and you'll notice now that index number 0 is holding number 16. And cycling through the code here, you'll notice now that things are filled up. But there's a whole lot of wasted space towards the bottom here. So rather than doing that, we may choose to go back and say, look, I'm after the likes of 8 names. If I was to go through and run this once more, you'll notice that we don't have that waste of space anymore. Okay, everything's being used up. Okay, so, except for this one here. Sorry, I should have actually gone through and said that we're wanting to use the likes of 7 items. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so there it is between 0 and 7, or 0 and 6 actually being used. Oh, one more line of code, push F10, my mistake. Okay, so if we're wanting to now go through and access the likes of one of those array items and actually output it to the screen, the way in which we would do this is we would bring up the details of the array, and you'll notice that it's popping up and showing this. And if I push the dot property, I can go through and indicate which item that I'd like to show. So one of the ways in which I can do that is I can do that through the rounded bracket and say that I'd like to output the contents of this to the screen. And then if I had a console dot read key, run the program, turn off the breakpoint, okay, so you'll notice here that it's showing index number 2, which in this situation here is showing as index number 2, holding the value of 12, popping up and showing as 12. Now the likes of arrays are really useful to use in terms of storing large amounts of information very efficiently. Not only can we have singular arrays, which is what we're dealing with, we can actually have an array of arrays or multiple arrays being used, and would often indicate the fact that we can do that with multiple arrays like so. Okay, so this is indicating multiple arrays being used. We don't need to worry about that at level 2. What we're going to be focusing on here is just working with a singular array. Okay, so in this situation here, what if I wanted to output all of the contents of my array? Well, because these numbers will go between 0 and 7, that should be screaming to you the fact that we could actually use one of our counted loops, and with this loop you'll notice that I has already got a value of 0, and we could go up all the way up to 7, and then we could use the contents of that instead of this hard-coded 2 value. We could replace it with this variable of I. And doing this, if we were to have a console.writeLine, you'll notice now that it's outputted all of those numbers back to my screen. Problem with that, however, is we are often going to be out by 1. So in this case I said between 0 and 7, but because of the way that I've done this, it's actually managing to only do it up to number 6. The negative 6 was not being returned. So in actual fact I would need to go through and alter this to be less than or equal to 7, or I could simply go through and change this to 8. But we nonetheless we run the risk of not quite managing to hit all of the items within our array. We need to be quite switched on and clever in knowing how many items are there. Other ways in which we can do it is we can actually tell the array to figure that out itself about how many items that we actually have. So by putting in the array name and then doing count, we can go through and actually use this to work out how many items are in the array, and then I'd like to keep going up until you find that. Okay, so the last item that we should see displayed on my screen should be negative 6. I'm going to put a little breakpoint in here so you can see the program cycling through this, because it will indicate one of the problems that we may have. Okay, so as we have iterated through or passed through this loop a number of times, if you put your mouse on this and open it up, you'll notice that we're probably going to be starting to see how things are cycling through. We're now up to I being 3, so it's outputting at this stage 26. And we're now up to the likes of 5. I'll put a little breakpoint over here, and if I can get it up, there it is. Just so you can kind of see how things are flowing. So it's now up to I equal to 6. So we're going to be watching the contents of this appear. So while 6 is less than the count of it, now the count of it is basically going to work out how large this is going to be. Okay, so I now is set to 7, so 7 is going to be less than the count, but what is the count? It's still a bit unclear at this point. Okay, so the count of it that you can see there is going to be equal to 8, because that matches up with this number. That's fine provided that we use the less than symbol. If, however, we did what we said before and we use less than or equal to, we will generate an error. And the error is something called an out by 1 error, whereby we're trying to show the 8th index of this array, and because there is no 8th index, we're going to run into problems. So if we take off the error or the breakpoint and try and run this through, you'll see the error that occurs, and it's called an index out of range exception, or out by 1 error. It means that we've gone too far past the boundary of our array, and as a result we're a bit stuck. So one of the loops that I find a bit more handy than this is a smarter loop called a for each loop. This loop is smart enough to know when exactly when we have finished working through this collection. So the syntax is for it is going to be this var, which stands for variable. Okay, so basically can handle different data types such as strings and integers, etc. So if we don't go through and specify anything, it will know that it'll just deal with whatever it is. It would be better if we could actually specify the data type that we're dealing with, but in this instance it's fine for us to deal with var. Then we've got this temporary variable name that's always defaulting to item. We can call this whatever we want, it doesn't really matter, it's not really important, other than the fact that when we'd like to update and use things in code, we will use this word here. So I'm going to go through and call this item like we had before. The main thing that we need to look at changing is this one here. This one here needs to be the collection which is holding our information, which in this case is an array, and we're going to go through and put the name of this. Now when we go through and do the console.writeLine, we don't need to refer to the array and their specific index. It's smart enough to know that it will begin at the lowest index within our array and it will finish after the last index within our array has been outputted. And the way that we will use this is with this local variable here called item. So we're simply going to plug this in. I'll block this bit of code here out so you can see the program up and running. Push F5, and it's smart enough, as I say, to go through and output all of the numbers within our array. Now if of course we had a few more from above, we had a couple of extra areas being allocated that weren't being used, okay, those would be loaded up with zeros. So that's where we need to make sure that perhaps we don't have too many bits of pieces that aren't being used. So that's effectively how we can use the likes of arrays. Now, as I mentioned before, we can actually store things like letters into something called a character array, and that's how we will often deal with strings when we kind of take them in. We'll break them up into little pieces, and then we might be able to cycle through that, which would be the likes of, say, a password program which needs to have a certain level of strength, such as uppercase, lowercase letters, numbers, special characters, etc. We could analyze each letter or character of that string, and then we could go through and then just do a check on each of those items. One of the ways in which we can perhaps work with some of those characters or letters is to use a different data type that we haven't covered so far, called a char. So a char basically means a single character. So I may choose to look at using the likes of a char to indicate that we'd like to deal with a letter. When we're wanting to give a char some kind of descriptor and say we're wanting it to hold a letter, rather than using a simple quotation mark, we will use an apostrophe instead. Okay, so in this case, this char called letter is going to store the value of a lowercase a. If I was to try and output this to the likes of my console, okay, and try and run this, okay, so here's my program up and running now, running through. All it's going to do is output the likes of this char back to the screen. Okay, so further down the track we might look at some additional problems and uses that the likes of chars could use, but often are used within arrays. Right, so that's the use of how we can work with arrays. Not going to get into too much detail for arrays because, as I said earlier, I kind of find the likes of lists a bit more useful for us. So I'm going to start the next tutorial, which will go into the likes of this. Alright, so let's look at doing some lists now. So lists are dynamic, and the fact that they will automatically resize based on the fact that we can plug things into lists and it will get progressively bigger. We don't need to go through and specify how big the thing is going to be to begin with. So it's a relatively new concept compared to arrays, and lots of different programming languages have them. C# makes good use of them, so we'll make a start on this now. Alright, so the main thing that we need to go through and deal with is that we're going to go through and specify the fact that we are wanting to use a list, and we're going to use the fact that we use the keyword list, and then we're going to go through and specify that we want it to be a list of, say, integers. Alright, just before we finish up and wrap up with using the likes of arrays, some of the things that we can use in terms of its built-in functions that it has available to it is the fact that we might choose to sort the numbers maybe within ascending order. Okay, so in order for us to do this, we will use the key term array.sort, and then you'll notice here that we've got some kind of different ways of being able to structure things. The way in which we're going to do it here is do the rounded brackets, and then it's got array asking for the one-dimensional system array to sort, which is simply asking for us to put in the name that we've used for our array. By doing this line of code here now and trying to output the results, you'll see the order of these entries being ranked in ascending order. Okay, so that's one of the things that we might find quite useful. Another thing that we might find useful is if we're wanting to maybe work out, well, what is the highest number and the lowest number within this array. So if I was to go through and put in the name of my arrays, push the dot property, you'll notice that there's all these bunch of different things that we can do. One of the things that we can do is we could actually work out, well, what is the average of those arrays. The next thing that we might choose to do is go through and do some other useful functions, such as working out, well, what is the max number in our array, what is the min number in our array, and perhaps what is the total or sum of all the items added together within our array. Now, with a bit of concatenation on the end here, this would be a little bit more obvious, but the first item that we'll see in terms of the numbers will be the average, the max, the min, and then the sum. If I'm wanting to go through and have a few extra kind of line breaks so that we can make these a bit more obvious, I could simply go through and do a few more. Or another way of doing it is to actually go through and to use some of these kind of command or control sequences to go through and to place in some extra lines. So a \n is the equivalent of me doing an enter. So if I do a few of these \n's, it's going to give the appearance of actually me pushing enter a number of times. I can also go through and plug this directly inside of my code so that I can do the likes of a \n here, and then I'd need to look at concatenating on from this point. Another thing I can do is I can actually use some other control sequences to do things like a tab by pushing on the tab key. Okay, so using those can be quite useful in terms of formatting, can be a different way of potentially showing the stuff back. Okay, so here's all those extra enters that I plugged in here, and then we're looking at things like, this is the average of all the numbers added together, the average of all the numbers. We've got a couple of lines in between. We've got the maximum number, we've got the minimum number, and you'll notice it's been tabbed across, and then we've also then got the sum, or the total of all those numbers added together. So those are some of the other useful functions that I've come across that we might want to use. Have a little look through at the list, because there's a whole bunch of other ones that perhaps you might want to look at exploring and seeing how you can get them to go. A lot of crossover in terms of some of your maths skills as well. Many of those we don't need to worry about and use, but there could be some useful things in there that you might like to look at taking a look at. Okay, so that's going to be the likes of arrays pretty much in a nutshell, and we're going to move on to working with lists in the next tutorial. Okay, so we'll just go through and close the solution, and then we'll basically start a new one for working with lists.